So now we want to welcome you to this webinar, Nutrition and Functionality of the Proteins, and what you need to know about the whey and dairy proteins. We are offering this webinar from USDEC, who is the Export Council of the United States. To those who don't know me and those who have seen me in other events from the region, my name is Carolina Nascimento. I am the partner of the consultant company River Global, and River Global is the representative of U.S. Dairy Export Council in South America, and we are responsible to promote dairy products from the United States, which includes cheese and, of course, the ingredients of the milk that we are going to discover and talk and know a little bit more about today. We work with instructional work supporting the industry, exporters, distributors, and the academy to know more about the products from the cow milk from the United States, the functionalities, applications, and providing technical information and support of the development of formulations, in addition to help them to be in touch directly with suppliers from the United States. It is a great pleasure for us once again to be here with you. And I also wanted to thank all the attendees from Colombia, Peru, Chile, and other countries from the region. Welcome. Throughout this webinar, you will receive from the hand of experts information about the proteins of the milk, cow milk, compare with plant-based proteins. We are going to know about the nutritional aspects and the technical characteristics related to their functionalities, processing characteristics, and applications in different formulations in beverage and also food. So now let's give the welcome to our speakers of today. The first one is our colleague, Terry Rexroth. She is the Vice President of Marketing, Global Marketing of Ingredients in Dairy Export Council. Good morning, Terry.
Good morning, Carolina, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Gracias, Terry.
Thank you very much, Terry. We also have with us today Matthew Pikovsky. He is the Vice President of Research and Nutrition at National Dairy Council. Good morning, Matt.
Good morning, Carolina, and good morning, everyone who was able to join today. Really looking forward to interacting with you.
Gracias, Matt.
Thank you very much, Matt. And our special guest is Mary Wilcox. Mary is consultant and founder of the company Significant Outcomes. Good morning, Mary.
Good morning, Carolina. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here. I hope you enjoy what we have to share.
Bienvenida. Gracias a todos.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone. So before continuing with the main presentation, I would like to ask a couple of questions to you about the market and the 10 trends of the use of proteins. Please, if you could kindly help us. The first question is, do you or does your company have interest in dairy protein, plant-based protein, or both? Now you have the survey or the poll on the screen. I'm gonna give you a couple of seconds for you to vote.
Okay. Bastante participación.
We have a lot of participation right now. Perfect. Perfect.
Y la segunda pregunta.
And the second question is,
antes de la segunda pregunta.
before the second question, let's go with the answers. from the first question. So here we have clearly that 75% of our attendees are interested in both proteins. 13% in whey and dairy proteins, and 11% in plant-based proteins. Thank you. Now, the second question, which is, which categories would have the greatest development potential in food and beverage with proteins? We have some options such as bakery, nutrition bars, confectionery, dairy foods, beverages, healthy snacks, dressings, and sauces.
Un poquito más.
A few more seconds.
Oh, más de la mitad. Ya.
More than half has voted.
Perfecto.
Perfect. Thank you. Now the results, just so you know. So we have 60% that are interested in dairy products. And others such as beverages are also very interesting, and healthy snacks, especially now, since we are spending a lot more time in home. And there we have other important categories such as confectionery. And thank you very much to everyone who voted. Now we are going to continue with the presentations.
Finish pool. Okay, okay. Perfecto, siguen.
Perfect.
Solo un momentito.
Give me 1 second, please. Now we are going to continue with our presentation. I just want to give some information before we move on with the first presentation. Oh, we are seeing lots of questions right now. Okay, so the time has come. Presentation. Our experts are going to provide a presentation that lasts about 1 hour and 15 minutes. So please stay with us and pay close attention to the information of the presentations. And in the end, please don't miss, because we are going to have a Q&A session that it will be very interactive. We want you to send your question through the Q&A session, through Zoom and through the chat. And we also have some questions that we receive in the registration stage. So we are going to try to answer many of them. And if we are not able to answer all of the questions, we are going to do it after the event. So now we can move on with the presentation, and happy webinar.
Hi, everyone.
Buenos días a todos, bienvenidos a todos y gracias por estar acá en nuestro seminario. Mi nombre es Terry Rexroad.
For the U.S. Dairy Export Council. We are pleased to offer today's webinar, U.S. Dairy Protein Nutrition and Functionality, what you need to know about dairy and plant-based proteins. During the webinar, please enter your questions in the box available on your screen. And at the end, we will host a Q&A session. We will answer as many questions as possible, time permitting, and all unanswered questions will be addressed by email after the webinar. First, a little about USDEC for those of you that may not be familiar with us. We are a nonprofit membership organization working on behalf of U.S. dairy farmers. Since USDEC was founded in 1995, U.S. dairy exports have increased by more than 7-fold to over $6.6 billion annually. In 2020, the U.S. dairy industry exported a record volume of 2.1 million metric tons, which is the equivalent of 16% of US milk solids. We have offices located in export markets around the world, across Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. Our global team is focused on building demand for US dairy ingredients and cheese. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers. First is Matthew Pekoski, Vice President of Nutrition Research for the National Dairy Council. In this role, Matt leads the Dairy Protein Nutrition Research Program to build scientific evidence supporting the benefits of milk and dairy protein ingredients. Today, Matt will review the nutrient profiles of dairy and plant proteins, and he'll explain how dairy proteins provide unmatched nutrition benefits across all life stages. Our second speaker, Mary Wilcox, is the founder of consulting company Significant Outcomes LLC, and she has over 25 years of experience in product development and business development for food and agriculture. In today's presentation, Mary will help navigate the protein landscape by comparing the functional properties of dairy and plant proteins. These properties are critical in the successful formulation of foods and beverages. Welcome, Matt and Mary.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Pekoski. I'm the Vice President of Nutrition Research with the National Dairy Council based in the US. Thanks for joining me today for my presentation titled Advantages of Dairy Proteins versus Plant Proteins with a focus on nutrition. Now, protein is an essential nutrient required by our body every day. And amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, provide structural components needed for a number of critical body functions. While most people are familiar with the link or association between amino acids, dietary protein, and having muscle building or muscle support, there's actually a number of essential body functions that require dietary protein and then the essential amino acids from that protein. And that, as noted in that first bullet, not only strong muscle, but also the skeletal system. So, adequate protein is important to support bone health. We need protein to transport oxygen to our muscles. That's the body protein hemoglobin. Metabolize other nutrients that help with digestion and obviously getting the nutrients to our body and organs and tissues that need that. That's enzymes, which is a protein. And then healthy immune functions, certainly important in today's environment of the pandemic that we're still working through. And that's the function of immune proteins. Now, next layer of detail when you're thinking about amino acids, there are two core categories of amino acids. There's the essential or indispensable amino acids. Those amino acids are not able to be made by the body, therefore they must be supplied by the diet. And then there's the other amino acids that are called the dispensable or the non-essential amino acids. And again, those can be made by the body and don't necessarily need to be provided by the diet, although they are. So again, a focus really from diet and looking at, whether it's the total diet or individual foods, we want to look at a food's ability to provide those essential amino acids, those 9 essentials, which cannot be made by the body. They must be supplied by the diet. And we know that the essential amino acids, and in particular the branch chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, and valine. And then I would say over the last 10 to 15 years or so, there's been a growing body of literature and emphasis on leucine in particular as probably the most important of the essential amino acids when we're looking at stimulating and supporting muscle protein synthesis. And lastly, in a big picture, insufficient of intake of essential amino acids is going to compromise the ability of tissue to grow, be repaired, or be maintained. And that's going to have ultimately a cascade of negative effects on our overall health. Comparing different proteins, hopefully many of you have heard of the topic or term protein quality. And in a general sense, this helps to indicate the fact that not all proteins are created equal when it comes to the nutrition that they provide. Protein quality could be defined as the ability of a food protein to meet the body's metabolic demand for amino acids and nitrogen. And that metabolic demand, goes back to the slide, the topics that I mentioned on that first slide, right? Supporting musculoskeletal health, transport of oxygen to tissues, digestion of the food we eat through enzymes, etc. Now, food proteins vary in their protein quality based on three key factors: amino acid composition, with higher quality proteins having the full array of essential amino acids in sufficient amounts required by the body. Also, the digestibility of that protein, and then the bioavailability of the digested amino acids from that protein. Now, generally speaking, animal proteins are more digestible than plant proteins. And that's due to a few different factors. And primarily it's due to the other components that are found that's coming along with those proteins from that food source or ingredient source, right? And in particular, plant proteins in general, in comparison to animal proteins, have more what is called anti-nutritional factors that do inhibit either the digestion and or bioavailability of the protein and amino acids in that particular food source. Now, when it comes to protein quality, available, but there's two that I'm highlighting on this slide. The first, the PDCAS, or the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. That's really considered, has been around for a long time and is still considered the gold standard for assessing protein quality. It's recognized by the FDA and by groups such as the FAO. In addition, we have a more recent method called the digestible indispensable amino acid score. So that's a new model of protein quality assessments that was recommended a few years ago by an expert panel convened by the FAO to independently review current quality assessments and make recommendations as to if a new methodology should be utilized. And again, their conclusion was that this new DIAS method will be more accurate, and you'll be seeing it, if you haven't already, in the literature more and more. The table on your left here to end this slide is comparing both PDCAS and DIAS scores of a number of different ingredients, which you can see above the red line, and then whole foods, which you can see below the red line. And what's shown, whether it's an ingredient or whole food, or whether it's with PDCAS or DIAS, is that dairy proteins are the highest quality proteins available. Again, whether it comes from ingredient or whole food source. Now, when it comes to the real world application of this protein quality and the health and or physiologic endpoints that we could assess in terms of how protein quality is impacting our health, the primary way this is looked at scientifically is its ability to promote muscle gain and or maintain muscle. And while some folks may think muscle is only important in the sports and exercise space, young active adults, athletes, and or adults who have a concern in regard to their aesthetic appearance and the value that muscle plays there. But actually, that's an extremely small and closed-minded view, in my opinion, and I think in most scientists' opinion that are experts in this area. And that's because skeletal muscle, the quantity and quality of that muscle, play a key role in a number of ways to influence our health. You could see, plays role in strength and mobility. And of course, that's important in sport, but that's also important to support healthy aging. Think about, being in your middle age and older years and needing to carry groceries up a flight of stairs, or, do activities with your children and grandchildren, and things of that nature. The quality and quantity of your muscle is going to be important to allow you to continue to do those well into your older years. Muscle contributes to resting energy expenditure. It's metabolically active tissue in comparison to fat, which is not, so it contributes to calorie burning. So certainly muscle has a role in connection with weight management. It's also one of the primary sites of glucose disposal. So as such, muscle plays a role in metabolic regulation and has a role in terms of supporting metabolic health. So you can see here, with the greater quantity and quality of muscle that one possesses, you'll see a decreased risk for not only metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. Now, when it comes to the different physiologic processes going on in our body to kind of regulate or manage our ability to either gain, lose, or maintain muscle, we're looking at that balance between rates of muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. And when rates of synthesis will exceed breakdown, you're going to have muscle growth. And when the opposite is true, you're going to have muscle loss. And this slide shows that there are a number of different factors that may impact this balance between synthesis and breakdown, but the primary one that we have under our control, in addition to exercise, and the one in which I'm going to focus on for my talk today, is nutrition, and then more specifically, protein nutrition. Now, when it comes to protein recommendations, I think it's really important to clarify some of the confusion or what I think is a misinterpretation of those recommendations. So in the US and globally, as well as in individual countries, we have, what in the US we deem the recommended dietary allowance, or the RDA. And that's set at 0.8 grams per kilo body weight per day for adults. And often I will see, whether it's from health professionals or whether it's the press trying to laymanize scientific information for consumers, is that they will look at this level as kind of the goal or ceiling with which protein intake should not exceed. And they talk about anything in excess of the RDA as excessive and potentially harmful for health. And that is just not accurate. The RDA in this quote is actually from the document that outlines the RDA, is really that estimate of the minimum daily average dietary intake level that meets the requirements of nearly all healthy individuals. So again, the RDA should be viewed as a minimum amount to prevent deficiency. It is not an optimal amount to support health, or it is not a ceiling by which we should not exceed. We also have the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. So this provides, again, a range of protein intakes that can be consumed safely, okay? And as you can see the definition here, a range of intakes for a particular energy source that's associated with reduced risk of chronic disease while providing adequate intakes of essential nutrients. So that's 10 to 35% of total calories when it comes to protein. So to put that numbers into perspective, let's look at, for a 70 kilogram male consuming 2,000 calories a day, the RDA for that person would be 56 grams of protein per day. But what you can see with the AMDR is that it gives a much broader range or flexibility from which individuals can personalize their protein intake depending on their health and nutritional goals. Now, there's a large and growing body of research that supports that some population groups may benefit from intakes greater than the RDA. And as you can see here, there's research around athletes and highly active adults, older adults, and those interested in weight management. And when we're talking about higher protein intakes, I'm talking at the middle to upper end of that AMDR range. Now, as we don't have the time to go through the full body of literature in today's webinar, I'd like to highlight some conclusions from recent position stands and/or papers from expert panels to kind of give us a nice grounding of what's recommended in the scientific literature today. Now, here's a position stand from 3 prominent nutrition and fitness organizations based in North America. And you can see that their total protein intake recommended for athletes and active adults is around 1.2 to 2 grams of protein per kilo body weight per day. So again, notably higher than the current RDA. They also provide recommendations for suggested meal intakes, because we know not only the total amount of protein, but how that protein is distributed or consumed over the course of the day is important. So they recommend 20 to 30 grams and specifically call out high quality protein after workouts and at main meals. And one measure they use to indicate high quality protein is that they want that protein or that meal, that individual food, to deliver about 10 grams of essential amino acids. And that's what they're using as that indication of quality. And that's because research that's been done, and primarily done with various high quality proteins, has shown that the amount of protein consumed from those foods provides about 10 grams of amino acids, essential amino acids, and that maximizes the muscle protein synthesis response, which we remember is one of the key drivers for maintaining or increasing muscle. Similarly, when it comes to older adults, and here is indicated by those aged 65 and older, that expert groups have recommended higher protein intakes in comparison to the RDA. You can see the range here. A minimum protein intake for healthy adults has been recommended at about 1 to 1.2 grams of protein per kilo body weight per day. And that could go up to about 2 grams of protein per kilo body weight per day for those older adults who are dealing with severe illness or injury or marked malnutrition. Now, again, in addition to total protein intake, you can see to the right of this figure that there's additional recommendations for a certain amount of protein per meal, but also a certain amount of leucine per meal, which is, again, an indication or a proxy for the quality of that protein. And the importance of leucine with muscle metabolism and needing a certain amount of leucine, again, to be a proxy for protein metabolism, protein quality, and maximizing the muscle protein synthesis response. Now, in the literature, it's recognized that dairy proteins are some of the highest quality proteins, and they're recognized for their value and efficacy in supporting muscle health. And these quotes that are taken from 2 different position stands from these expert health professional organizations, which I have noted here, are specific to the sports and exercise space, as to that's where the largest body of literature to date has been published. And you could see from the first quote, I'll read, to date, dairy proteins seem to be superior to other tested proteins, largely due to leucine content in the digestion and absorptive kinetics of the branched chain amino acids in fluid-based dairy foods. Now, the second quote from the International Society of Sport Nutrition is similar. I won't take the time to read it, but again, it's calling out the quality of animal proteins and dairy proteins in particular in comparison to plant proteins, again, because of that higher amount and concentration of essential amino acids, leucine, and then for the digestibility and bioavailability of those amino acids. Now, the next few slides, I think, provide some very nice and handy charts, which look at essential amino acid concentrations and then subsequently leucine concentrations as a percent of total protein within a variety of plant and animal-based sources. You see the table here to the right, summarizes comparisons of some of these more succinctly. And what you could see is that the dairy proteins have notably higher essential amino acid concentrations than the other proteins listed, and particularly in comparison to some of the popular plant proteins. So again, they're more efficient in their delivery of essential amino acids, which is going to be important for muscle health. Similar conclusion when it comes to leucine. Again, you look at both whey and casein, the 2 dairy proteins, they have the highest percent leucine concentration from a total protein perspective when you compare them to all of the other proteins. And again, look at the differences across whey and casein in comparison to some of the more popular plant-based ones, whether it's rice, soy, lentil, etc. It could be upwards of 2 times the amount or percent of leucine in comparison to some of these other sources. Now, there's some discussion certainly in the food and beverage community that these differences in protein quality from individual animal proteins or dairy proteins in comparison to plant proteins can be accounted for or made up for by blending whether it's 2 or more plant protein ingredients together. And if by doing that, there's a thought that you might be able to match in terms of quality. Well, here is a recently published study that examined that exact question. So what you could see, and the number of the different blends are shown below the table here, is that there are 3 different plant protein blends, and they were compared to whey protein isolate. So the C in the table is the whey protein isolate, and then numbers 1 through 3 are different plant protein blends. And what they did is that they matched for total leucine content, PD-CAS score, and total essential amino acid content. And again, theoretically, they should have the same response in the body given the efforts made to match on those factors. Now, there's one thing I want to point out here before we look at some of the results from this study is that, the simple fact that in order to match the leucine and essential amino acid content from the whey protein isolates, the 3 different blends had to provide about 10 grams more of total protein. So again, that shows the efficiency with which whey protein isolate in this example specifically is delivering those key amino acids, essentially the efficiency with which it's going to support muscle health. Now, this first figure here looks at, changes in blood essential amino acids, total amino acids over the 4 hours in which they were measured. And you can see, despite matching for essential amino acid content and leucine content, the whey protein isolate group has a much higher, significantly higher blood levels of the essential amino acids. Here's another figure which just shows area under the curve. So for the total 4-hour period, again, blood levels of essential amino acids, which are important to support the muscle response to protein consumption, was significantly higher in comparison to all the blends. And, I'm not going to show the figures, but the leucine concentrations also were higher. You can see 28 to 35% higher for the whey protein isolates in comparison to the 3 different blends. So what this is showing is that, there's something beyond just the amino acid composition. Again, it's got to come down to either the digestibility and or ultimately bioavailability. Now, additional work would be needed to kind of look at, what's the physiologic or health impact of these differences in plasma amino acid responses. But in subsequent slides, I'm going to show some of the work that's been done that, again, would lend you to believe that these differences in blood amino acid levels is important. So again, for transitioning, I'm going to look at some of the data that's directly compared dairy versus plant proteins when it comes to muscle health. Just to orient you, typically what's done is either measuring muscle protein synthesis, which on subsequent slides you'll see is indicated by FSR or fractional synthetic rate on the graphs, and or measuring the amount of muscle gained over time. That's done with protein consumption, with or without exercise training. So this first study looked at whey protein in comparison to casein and then soy in a group of young adults, and it looked at it at rest and then after resistance exercise. And one thing to note here is that, what the investigators did in this experiment were actually try to match essential amino acid delivery. So they had to give a little bit more soy in comparison to whey protein to match providing 10 grams of essential amino acids. So, interestingly, this is really looking at potential differences from a digestibility and bioavailability perspective when it comes to whey and soy. And what you could see is that after exercise, the whey protein group resulted in significantly higher muscle protein synthesis in comparison to the soy group. Now, when we look at, again, those blood essential amino acid levels, you can see particularly at the early time periods, 30 and 60 minutes, whey protein is in this upper line, had higher total essential amino acids in comparison to the soy and casein groups. And similarly, when it comes to leucine, again, at 30 and 60 minutes, significantly higher plasma levels of leucine from the whey group in comparison to the other 2 groups. And again, that's likely part of the mechanism that's driving the benefit when it comes to greater muscle protein synthesis. Now, the next question would be, do acute or short-term differences in muscle protein synthesis over time impact the amount of muscle gained? And here's one of the longest training studies, one of the longest controlled training studies that's been done and published to date. There's a 9-month resistance training program, including previously untrained college-aged men and women. They supplemented daily with about 20 grams of either whey protein, soy protein, or calorie-matched carbohydrate control. And they did a routine resistance exercise training, again, over 9 months. And what you can see here on the left is that the whey protein group gained significantly more muscle, 3.3 kilograms of muscle over the 9-month period, in comparison to the soy group, who gained 1.8, and then the carbohydrate group, who gained 2.3 kilograms of muscle. So again, these acute differences in muscle protein synthesis are likely what contributed to these greater gains in muscle mass over time. Just to again show you some of these differences in blood amino acid levels, and here looking at leucine specifically in the 60 minutes post-exercise, either in the untrained state to the left or the trained state after 9 months of training to the right. And again, the whey protein group, you see notably higher leucine in the blood in comparison to the other two supplemented groups. Now, similar positive results, whether comparing whey protein or milk in comparison to soy protein ingredient or soy beverage, have been demonstrated in other studies with resistance exercise. And that's been shown in both old and younger adults. Now transitioning outside of the sports and exercise realm into the weight management realm. And as I alluded to in the previous slide, muscle can play an important role in weight management in terms of supporting energy expenditure. And certainly from a health standpoint, it's going to be preferential to maintain muscle during weight loss while preferentially losing body fat. And we know research has generally established that during a weight loss diet where you're eating less calories than are required for your energy needs, that higher protein diets will help to preserve muscle during that weight loss period. What hasn't been shown is there a difference between the quality of protein provided within that scenario? So this study looked to address that question. So we had 40 overweight and obese men and women, about middle-aged, 50 years old, a 14-day weight loss diet. They supplemented 2 times a day with either whey protein, soy protein, or carbohydrate. And to the right here is the figure, is the results. Again, at the beginning of the 14-day period, and then at the end of the 14-day weight loss period. And the 3 primary findings are: 1, whey protein exceeded soy protein when it came to muscle protein synthesis, right? Whether it was at the beginning of the trial or the end of the 14-day weight loss period, rates of muscle protein synthesis were significantly higher for whey in comparison to both soy and carbohydrate. Additionally, whey protein attenuated the decline in post-meal rates of muscle protein synthesis after weight loss compared to soy protein. And what this is going to do over time is ultimately this may lead to a greater preservation of muscle during long-term weight loss interventions, which again is going to be a preferential outcome. So protein quality here examined between providing whey protein in comparison to soy does seem to impact muscle metabolism in a weight loss phase, and again, which may lead to preferential changes in body composition over time. Now, the next group I want to look at is older adults, and again, that category of healthy aging. And we know muscle is critically important for older adults because, as we age, we do lose muscle. We also lose muscle strength and function. And what that leads to is sarcopenia. And we know that sarcopenia has a significant number of health problems that it causes: increases rates of falls and fractures, increases dependent living, also increases morbidity and mortality. So, this study looked at, 20 healthy older adults and actually did a bed rest model. So this is kind of, a few days of bed rest, which would be similar to acute hospitalization, and or if you were just, laid up in bed at home, due to an illness or injury or something similar. So again, a 7-day bed rest study followed by 5 days of rehabilitation to see if they could gain back some of the function that was lost during the rest period. Diets were matched for total calories and macronutrient composition, but the quality of the diets were varied. As in the whey diet, there was about 10 to 15 grams of whey protein provided at each meal, and that was swapped out from some other proteins that were provided at those meals in the mixed diets. Again, to improve the overall quality of the protein in the diet via whey protein. So here you could see the total protein provided from the mixed diet and the whey groups, both during the bed rest period and the 5-day rehabilitation period. And actually, while they were trying to match these protein intakes, the whey groups had a bit less or a bit lower total protein intake when it came to bed rest and rehabilitation. You could also see just the percent animal and plant proteins within the two diets. Again, slightly more animal protein, again, because they delivered that through some additional whey protein. But overall, I would say both of these diets are generally would be looked on as pretty high quality. But let's see, what did, supplementing a modest amount of whey protein at each meal do for these individuals? Well, we saw that bed rest, or these investigators saw that bed rest resulted in a decrease in muscle mass and strength in both groups. However, the whey diet was able to partially protect leg lean mass in comparison to the mixed diet. The whey group also lost more fat mass than the mixed group during bed rest. And lastly, following the 5-day rehabilitation period, the whey group experienced a full recovery of muscle strength, while the decrement in strength persisted in the mixed group. So again, this could have significant implications, not only for medical nutrition, both during and post hospital discharge, but also, in older adult nutrition in general. When we have periods of decreased activity, being cognizant of trying to include higher quality proteins in your diet can be beneficial. Now, I do want to acknowledge that there are studies that demonstrate that these differences in protein quality between dairy proteins and plant proteins or lower quality proteins can be accounted for by simply consuming a higher amounts of lower quality protein. And this figure on the right here is trying to illustrate that concept by showing different amounts of rice protein isolate or whey protein isolate, and how those different amounts across higher increasing levels would ultimately help one to get into this threshold, this ideal range for a certain amount of leucine, which we have here, 1.7 to 3.5 grams of leucine. And that's, once you exceed that range, you're not getting an additional benefit. So a good analogy to think of, you could think of your muscle as kind of a cup. And the protein and amino acids going into that muscle is like pouring water into a cup. And there's going to be a point at which you are pouring amino acids or pouring water into that cup, where that cup becomes full. That water is no longer beneficial. It just overflows and is essentially goes unused. And that's how you could look at this muscle full effect, or the ability of different proteins to fill that cup, and then by which providing additional protein or additional essential amino acids is no longer going to have an effect. So with a lower quality protein, it's less efficient at filling that cup, but if you provide enough of it, that cup will eventually be filled. So here you could see supplementation with whey protein or rice protein at 48 grams per day resulted in similar improvements in body composition and exercise performance following 8 weeks of resistance training in young men. Now, the point here is that what we've seen, and if you recall the recommendations from the position stands for sports and exercise to maximize the muscle response to training, recommended somewhere about 20 to 30 grams or about 10 grams of amino acid. So this greatly exceeded that. But that higher level was needed from this lower quality protein in order to provide enough of those essential amino acids to get the effect. Similar concept here in older men, 35 grams of casein, but not wheat protein hydrolysate increased muscle protein synthesis, but then 60 grams of wheat protein hydrolysate was needed to increase muscle protein synthesis in those older men. Lastly, 70 grams of microprotein increased muscle protein synthesis to a greater extent than milk protein. However, look at the amounts. Again, 70 grams of microprotein, which provides a mix of total protein and some carbohydrate in comparison to less than half milk protein, 26 grams. Again, so these are not gram for gram comparisons. In this instance in particular, you had to provide more in order to get that effect. Now, some may say, what's the problem with providing a bit more? Just eat a bit more plant protein, you'll get similar benefits. Well, I think that is a particular thing to consider and may not be the most prudent recommendation when you think about, the extremely high rates of overweight and obesity throughout the world that we're faced with today, right? Simply recommending to the general population, just eat more plant protein to get those benefits that are derived from dairy proteins, is not prudent when, with eating more protein, you're going to bring more calories, and which could be contributing to weight gain. Here you can see from a review paper from Dr. Bob Wolf, looking at the kilocalories, per gram of protein for a number of different plant and animal sources, right? And what you can see, again, whey protein specifically is most efficient, and then, animal proteins are going to be more efficient than plant proteins when it comes to delivering essential amino acids in comparison to the amount of calories. And I'll read the quote here to summarize from Dr. Wolf. The essential amino acid to calorie ratio for high protein foods must also be considered when comparing protein-rich foods. High quality proteins, such as milk proteins, enable essential amino acid requirements to be met with less caloric intake compared to lower quality proteins. So again, this is going to have significant implications for the general population who already are looking for ways to reduce calories in their diet, while then, juxtaposition to likely wanting to or needing to increase protein intakes to get some of those benefits that we reported in previous slides. Now, here's another way to look at the similar concept. So if you recall, there are some experts suggesting for aiming somewhere between 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine per meal to help maximize muscle protein synthesis. So what this table does is look at, whey protein isolate in comparison to soy protein isolate, and then a number of different animal and plant-based foods, and the amount that would be need to consumed to get 2.5 grams of leucine. And it looked at in terms of, as you can see, the calories to get 2.5 grams of leucine. At the lowest amount, whey protein, 100 calories, just goes up significantly from there when you go from to soy protein isolate to then whole foods, chicken, canned tuna, etc., down to some of these plant-based portions, which again are just not efficient with which they deliver leucine in this case, and a number of more calories are coming with that. And again, you can see, total protein is getting much higher as you go to lower quality proteins in order to get that amount of leucine. So again, we're in the big picture, we're talking about the efficiency with which dairy proteins optimally deliver these essential amino acids and leucine in a highly digestible, highly bioavailable form that's going to maximize and support muscle health. So in terms of my key takeaways for this webinar, again, dairy proteins are the highest quality proteins available, and that's been shown most recently with this newly recommended way to assess protein quality from that expert panel convened by the FAO, the digestible indispensable amino acids score. And that could be due to any one of and/or combination of the 3 different components that influence protein quality, right? That's a superior amino acid composition, having the full array of essential amino acids in the optimal amounts to support the body's needs. Also, you may have higher digestibility and/or bioavailability of those essential amino acids due to less anti-nutritional factors that can limit those things, which are higher in different plant foods. Now, when you think of the real-world implications of protein quality, it looks at the ability of a protein to support muscle protein synthesis and how that then translates to muscle health. Now, some may have traditionally thought of this primarily in the sports nutrition world, but actually, hopefully you've learned through the information I've taken you through today, that actually has broad implications across the lifespan. And I've highlighted examples both with weight management and healthy aging. The available data supports that dairy proteins, and primarily whey protein from the literature that's been published, are superior to plant proteins in stimulating muscle protein synthesis. And differences in protein quality, while they can be accounted for by consuming a greater amount of lower quality protein, we need to think of the unintended consequences of making such a general blanket recommendation. I did highlight the implications in terms of consuming additional calories and how that could impact, weight management. What I didn't really have time to indicate, but I do want to mention here and seed it for further discussion, is that this also has implications in the need to produce more plant proteins in order to provide more total protein that would need to be consumed to match this protein quality, or actually match the health benefits from consuming more lower quality proteins. And what does that mean from a sustainability perspective? We know that sustainability is growing in importance, not only with consumers, scientists, and actually policy makers when you're looking at global implications of our food system. So when you're looking at different proteins, you need to think about it from a sustainability perspective, not only simply on the weight of the protein and how that might impact environmental considerations, but can that be corrected for protein quality? And there is research that's been published to show that when different environmental impacts such as greenhouse gas are expressed based on the quality of that protein, it really diminishes that difference in environmental impact when you're looking at plant proteins in comparison to dairy protein. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to addressing any questions you may have.
This is Mary Wilcox, and I'm the owner of Significant Outcomes LLC. That I work with clients side by side to help them identify opportunities in the food industry. And more specifically, I have spent the majority of my career working in protein. So the purpose of my talk today is to bring you some information about the protein landscape. As you know, in the media these days, everywhere you look, there's a headline about a new source of protein, a new company delivering proteins, and the field is starting to get a little more crowded, which is fine, but it also can be confusing and you may not know where to go. So that's the point of my presentation today, is to help you identify what are those protein sources that are out there, but also how do they compare? What do they look like? And then also to let you know what U.S. dairy protein and their role is in this landscape as well. So let's dig in. As I said, in my career, the ingredient options have changed. When I first started my career over 25 years ago, we had our choice of soy, hydrolyzed collagen, and whey protein, but whey protein was still relatively new on the market at the time. And now today we have more options than ever before, and there are more that are continuing to emerge. So let's go through what those look like. But before we do that, as formulators and business managers and sourcing agents, I know that you are in charge of delivering formulations that are successful to meet the everyday challenges of consumers. But in order to do that, it's very complicated. And this hexagon represents the key areas of information that are required when you're making those decisions about what your final concept is going to look like. So as you can see here, we have nutrition, processing, functionality, usage, supply, and sustainability. But for today's focus, we're going to not cover nutrition. There's been a lot of clinical nutrition science around protein and high quality protein diets and the impact that they have and why they're vital for life. But there's such a depth of information there, we'll handle that in a separate presentation. But for my talk today, let's start with processing. So processing can vary by the source material. As you look here, you'll see that we have flours, concentrates, and isolates. And of these three sources, if you look at the chart, if you go from left to right, you can see that flours generally require fewer steps. Concentrates require a few more steps, and they tend to be concentrated to higher levels of protein, around 80%, give or take, depends upon the source. Isolates, on the other hand, tend to be over 80% and many of them over 90%. So as you can imagine, there are additional steps required to further concentrate and purify the isolates. So just remember, in general, as you increase in protein, there is more processing required. The other thing I want to talk about is the dairy cow. She's actually very uniquely designed. The cow itself has a 4-chambered stomach, and of her 4-chambered stomach, the rumen in particular is pretty unique. She can consume things that are insoluble and also undigestible by humans. 80% of what she eats is material that we as human beings can't even digest. So she can take in those insoluble and undigestible materials. And in the rumen, the microorganisms that exist there help to digest that food into precursors for protein. Those precursors are then reassembled in the cow and excreted out the mammary system as this water-soluble, highly nutritious matrix called milk. That milk can then be turned into nutrient-rich foods and beverages that we can enjoy, and then the undigestible components are excreted and can be used as fertilizer on cropland to help replenish the soil that growing the crops and the plants may have depleted. But the key thing here, other than the fact that she is very unique in what she does as this converter of inedible materials into nutritious materials, is she turns insoluble into water soluble. So keep that in mind as we continue to discuss processing. So for about 30 years now, the dairy industry has been researching ideas of ways to physically separate milk into its components. So separating the protein from the fat and the different nutritional components within milk. As a part of that, one of the technologies that has proliferated the industry is a physical separation that uses membrane filtration and water. So think of it as the same or similar type of system as you would have for a water filtration system at home. But in this case, they use that to filter out the protein or fat and carbohydrates into different fractions. The nice thing about this is it's physical, it's gentle. It also helps maintain the co-products that come off. So in the case of milk and whey, the co-product that comes off is called permeate, pictured here. And that permeate can then be isolated and turned into other higher value applications for food usage. So protein processing, as I said, can start from the raw materials or it can start from co-products. So on this slide, you'll notice that this is from the raw material. And this is a study that was just conducted last year, comparing what the protein processing schematics might be of different materials. So on the left, you have milk protein, and as you can see, we separate the cream and then filter, concentrate, and dry. When you compare that to pea protein, rice, wheat, or chickpea, you can see that there's different steps depending upon what you start with. They may have to grind or dehull or split or extract or enzyme or wash or decant. There's different types of purification processes involved. I would say just in general, and if you look at the ones with the red boxes in particular, those steps tend to use solvents, salts, acids, and bases. So there is some kind of a conversion in order to solubilize the protein. On this slide, this is where we're starting from the co-products. So whey proteins, as an example, is a co-product of the cheese-making industry. And so that's why we're starting with whey. But once again, we have the separation, filtration, concentrating, and drying. If you look at soy, almond, potato, and canola, you'll also see there's some additional steps once again to precipitate, neutralize, extract, and pre-prepare the products to solubilize those proteins. I would say just in general, a general rule of thumb, the more steps there is to any process, the greater the opportunity there is for the native protein structure to change or be altered based upon the process. So what might those processing conditions be? Well, they could be temperature, pH, pressure, solutes, or mixing, and I'll explain a little bit more. But the key here is not the conditions themselves. It's the fact that when they become extreme, that's when your protein becomes at risk of changing its structure and ultimately its solubility. and functionality, which we'll talk about later. So temperature, denaturation. Denaturation is just the impact of temperature, which it could be heating, cooling, or freezing, causing the proteins to unfold. That unfolding can change how the proteins are structured and function. But if you go too far, you can actually break or change the proteins in an irreversible way. An example of this is think about your morning breakfast. You have a fresh egg that you crack open. It's a liquid. When you put it in a frying pan with heat, what happens? The protein denatures and changes. The protein then becomes a solid that cannot go back to being a liquid. So that's just a visual example of what that might include. But as I said, denaturation can happen multiple ways. As far as pH, that's based upon the acidity and alkalinity of the protein. Proteins have an isoelectric point, and that point is when the neutral or the charge on the protein becomes neutral. When that happens, the proteins are more susceptible to precipitation. So acidity is a very important thing, and alkalinity, when you're thinking about how you process and how long you subject your proteins to different pHs. Pressure is another one. Salt use is a common one. So as I was saying earlier about the need for solubilization of protein in order to extract it, salt is a common way that many plant-based sources do that. So as they're adding the salt and solubilizing the protein, if there's too extreme, like there's too much, basically it can backfire and the proteins can precipitate in a way that is not desired from a process perspective. So keeping careful control of salt and sugar, both during processing and in finished product, is important to consider. Last but not least is shear. Shear is basically anything that causes the protein to break during mixing. It could be anywhere in your process. So it's important to engineer your processes with this in mind so that you can treat your proteins as gently as possible. So form impacting performance. As I just said, process then impacts the performance, and it does that through two different ways. There's functional properties and there's sensory properties. The functional properties are how ingredients behave. So how they work in your finished product from the time that you produce it and cook it and prepare it until the time you eat it. So depending upon your protein, it may function differently in different applications, which we'll discuss in a little while. Sensory evaluation is basically focused on sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. Once again, your process can also impact those characteristics, and we will discuss those in more detail. So functional properties. These are the general functional properties that occur in common food and beverage applications. So as you can see here, we have things that we're concerned about depending upon the application. For instance, we may need foaming, we may need water holding capacity, we may need emulsification, say in a super gravy. It just depends upon the application. So we'll go through a benchmarking study that took place to help you understand how these functionalities exist and what they mean as you're thinking about your proteins of choice for your formulations. So this benchmarking study specifically looked at water holding capacity, viscosity, heat stability, emulsion activity and stability, and foam activity and stability. So water holding capacity. I won't go into great detail on our methodologies, but I included them here for your information in case you decide you want to utilize some of them in your benchmarking that you do in-house. But specifically, water holding capacity is really an indication of how well that protein is soluble and can hang on to the water in your finished product. You'll also see on these slides as we go through them, off to the right, there's a protein legend. That legend dictates, if you look at the bottom of each protein source that was tested in this study, it has an abbreviation. So you can refer to that to understand which one is which. But that will be consistent throughout the slides that I'll be sharing. So here, when it comes to water holding capacity, you can see that milk, soy, and pea were greater than whey, potato, or rice. You can also see viscosity when it comes to water holding capacity. Another common measurement that's taken. As far as viscosity goes, this was measured with a viscosimeter, and the methodology is here for your information. And in this case, they used a 10% solution at room temperature for each protein source. As you can see, the milk and pea protein had higher viscosities than the whey, soy, potato, and rice. So with this in mind, with the water holding and viscosity, depending upon your application, you may choose certain proteins or not based upon the target of your final formulation. So if you're looking for something that is thicker or has a certain mouthfeel, or you need that water holding capacity to improve the structure or the texture of your product, you may choose a milk protein or a pea protein versus a whey in this situation. Heat stability. So this specifically is measuring how stable the proteins remain after heating at different pHs. And specifically, it's measuring the sediment or the protein falling out of solution. So the larger the value, in this case, the lower the heat stability. So it's desired to have a low value for better performance. So this slide shows heat stability at pH 3. So pH 3 would be a typical pH of a high acid, low pH, hot fill type process for finished products for a beverage, as an example. So as you can see here, whey protein actually performed better than the plant proteins and milk protein. And whey protein, and especially whey protein isolate, is well known for the fact that it performs well in these low pH conditions. And unlike some of the other proteins, it does provide clarity. So you can actually have a clear beverage or frozen item where you could have opacity and change the appearance. Heat stability at pH 7, however, differ. When you look at 7, which is more of a neutral pH, you see milk and whey protein performing better than the plant proteins. So if you're looking at more of an aseptic product from a beverage perspective, you might want to consider a milk or a whey protein versus one of the plant sources because of the stability. It depends upon the process of your finished product and how it will, what it will go through before it reaches the consumers. Emulsion activity and stability is another thing. So emulsions are basically when you have small droplets of liquids that combine together in a homogeneous way. It's very, very important to soups and sauces and gravies, and basically it's that idea of having an oil and a protein that exist together in a smooth sauce so that you don't detect separation. So the actual tests here, you'll notice they're centrifuged to see if there's separation. And there was 2 ways that they measured it. One was did it separate? And then secondly, what happened after heating and cooling? So the emulsion activity specifically here showed that milk and whey proteins, pea and soy, outperformed the potato and rice. However, after heating and cooling, you'll notice that the milk proteins and the whey protein concentrates outperformed the pea, soy, potato, and isolate. So if you were looking for something, like I said, specifically in a soup or a sauce, where you need that emulsion to hold together to maintain the visual appearance and the mouthfeel that you're looking for in your finished product, you may want to look at some of these proteins specifically for those types of applications. Foaming ability and foam stability. Many times in confections and baked goods, you need foam to help form the structure of your finished product. These abilities were tested via Vitamix 2 blender, and basically first it was the initial foamability, and then they waited 30 minutes to determine how stable that foam was. Did it maintain itself? So when it came to foamability, here we see whey proteins were better than the soy and potato, milk, pea, and rice. So if you're looking for a foaming protein, you may want to consider whey proteins in a baked good, for example. And stability-wise, you can see here as well, whey and then milk formed more stable foams than the plant-based proteins. So once again, depending upon the complexity of your application, you may want to consider their use. So censor, this was the other part of consumer acceptance. Proteins were rehydrated and then a trained panel tasted them. They were in duplicate and they tried them in 12 sessions to analyze the data. As you can see by this spidergram here, it shows the different intensities of the aromas. So for instance, if you look at bitter, the longer peak there is rice. When you see milky cooked, that's the milk protein. So those just give you some examples of how to read this. But the real key thing to remember is that there are flavor differences between plant and dairy proteins. As you can see here, on each side, there are some very unique flavors for each group, but there are some shared flavors between the two groups. I would say, just a general rule of thumb, as you increase the protein level of your protein sources, you'll tend to need higher levels of flavor in order to detect it in your applications. Also, depending upon the source that you're using, you may want to choose savory versus sweet or different levels of flavor in order to achieve your final product targets. This is also another reason why in some applications, plant proteins do require the use of masking agents in addition to flavor to hide some of the more plant-specific flavor profiles that come through. So appearance. We want to look at appearance depending upon your application at different pHs, as I mentioned before. So this was more of an aseptically processed product at 5% protein and specifically at neutral pH. And as you can see, there are some color and opacity differences. So depending on your final target of what you want to create, you may choose different proteins accordingly. When you go to pH 3, which is the higher acid, hot fill type conditions, which you'll see here, these beverages were heated to 82 C for 2 minutes. They do perform differently. The rice separated out right after processing, and the pea was actually after overnight. I will say that it's very important to think about your final process of your final application when choosing your proteins. It's also important to screen proteins from different sources. Even when within types of protein, different sources, because of those processing conditions I mentioned before, may perform differently. And so you need to assess that before you take it to your application. The proteins were also evaluated in bars. And this was a common bar where they made a 30% protein, 30% fat, 40% carbohydrate bar. They also put it into extended shelf life, accelerated shelf life, to determine what would happen with bar hardness. As you can see, the dairy-based proteins tended to be lighter in color, and then specifically the whey protein performed the best when it came to hardness. The plant-based were mixed. So for example, rice at the bottom that turned dark, it did not hurt, and it did well in hardness score, but it definitely turned dark. So a lot of times formulators will use blends of proteins in order to achieve just the right texture and chewability of their bars. So usage and versatility. So as I've been sharing here, all proteins are not equal, and selection really does matter. So here's some applications that I wanted to give you as examples, just to show you the breadth of what protein can deliver. As you can see here, proteins can be used in many applications across day part, and they can also be in different styles. So for instance, on the bottom left corner, we have the lentil power soup. The lentil soup has 20 grams of protein, and it combines the benefits of both the plant-based and the dairy-based protein sources into one product. Specifically on the dairy side, it uses micellar casein and MPC because they provide a lot of heat stability for the thermal processing that a soup will go through. They also use permeate to help prevent high levels of sodium by permeate itself being a flavor enhancement. But you can also see like the wellness wafer. It only has 5 grams of protein. It could easily be considered a snack and used in that perspective to get in some extra protein. This one specifically, though, uses the whey crisps, and the crisps were put in there to give it that extra little bit of crunchy texture to the formulation. But it also used the protein to bind it together to form the actual wafer. As you can see with the flatbreads and the bites, you also have the opportunity to incorporate many ingredients, both proteins, permeates, and even yogurt and cheese to add different flavor dimensions, as well as to give you the textural properties that you're looking for in your final application. Same thing with the biscotti. You know, it's very important to get the right texture depending upon your baked good. And in that case, it uses the skim milk powder in addition to the protein to provide that texture. So supply security. We definitely need ample, consistent, safe supply. Who wants to launch a new product and then suffer shortages or recalls or issues that will disappoint your customers? So it's very important to consider. So this slide shows an example from 2016 of the different amounts of different protein sources globally. As you can see, soy and dairy are more mature and more well established as an industry in their volumes, as some of the other plant sources are still coming online. This is an important consideration because they are still limited in their total supply, and as they're scaling up new operations and facilities, they still have to figure out all of the different processing in order to make sure you have consistent supply. So it's very important to benchmark your products and your ingredients over time to ensure that you're getting the solubility and functionality and performance that you're looking for. Dedication to quality and safety. Here in the US, the dairy industry is dedicated to testing from farm to fork, but this dedication also extends back to the farm. Farmers came together to come up with a voluntary and monitored approach to provide best-in-class animal care for their cows, and it has been ISO approved for international audiences. So this basically helps the farmers know the best practices and be audited to make sure they're following the best practices in cow care. So sustainability. We all know a lot of people are interested in this area. The dairy proteins actually have had life cycle assessments since 2012 and have continued to look at new technologies to make improvements so that they can continue to lower their impact. So let me give you some examples. Since 1950, we as an industry, in the dairy industry, milk fewer cows but make more milk. So the use of technology and genetics and feeding programs have helped improve this efficiency, which has also helped lower the carbon footprint. U.S. dairy farmers have also used technologies to change how they use their resources. So between 2007 and 2017, you can see here, they've used 30% less water, 21% less land for the same gallon of milk, and they've produced 19% less greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, when you look at the total greenhouse gas emissions for U.S. dairy, it accounts for 2% of the global greenhouse gas emissions versus, say, transportation, that's over 28%. So they continue to work and improve in this area. They also are looking at water, and because they use a water filtration system and the fact that milk is 87% water, dairy proteins in particular have the ability to use water, reuse water at every step of the way, whether it be in process. As each co-stream is taken off, water can be filtered out and purified and then be used to clean facilities, equipment, run the boilers, used in the landscaping and so forth. And the same thing on farm. Water there can also be recycled. So it really helps when it comes to efficiency and yield. The U.S. dairy farmers and processors also have an ongoing commitment to sustainability, and they have said they will report on meaningful progress every 5 years. So we know consumers are demanding a lot, and you as formulators and business managers have a lot to perform to meet their demands. They're looking for complete nutrition for their diets and their health and wellness. They want visual appeal because they want to know that it's high quality and it's a premium product. They want to explore global taste profiles and experience new textures to delight their taste buds. They're also very interested in easy to understand, clean labels for ingredients. They want to know that the ingredients are sustainably produced so that for the planet. And last but not least, they want consistent and safe supply that they know and they can trust to feed their families. So all of these different elements is a lot to deliver. But I hope you can see based upon what I've shared today that US dairy ingredients do have the ability to deliver convenient solutions to meet these demands. So just so you know, and we go back to the hexagon, there's lots of information that you may need as you're making your formulation decisions. So please feel free to visit thinkusadairy.org and their staff members for additional information. There's a lot of concepts and prototypes there for you to look at. There's technical information on functionality and understanding how an ingredient might function in your application. And they also have a database there to help you locate a US dairy ingredient supplier that may have the type of ingredient you're looking for your specific application. So with that, I will say thank you for your time and attention. As I said, I own Significant Outcomes LLC, listed here as a portfolio of my services. If I can ever be of assistance, please reach out. Thanks again, and have a great day.
Thank you, Matt and Mary, for sharing your valuable insights. Today's nutrition and functionality overview of dairy and plant proteins showcases the truly unique package provided by US dairy proteins. They offer strong functionality advantages to food and beverage processors, as well as unmatched nutrition benefits across all life stages. All proteins are not created equal, and no other type of protein ingredient offers the range of specific and quantifiable benefits provided by highly functional, nutritious, minimally processed, mild flavored US dairy proteins. As mentioned earlier, we're also very proud of our sustainability story, which is a cycle that starts with the US dairy farmers' commitment to unparalleled care and management of their cows to reduce the carbon footprint. The United States is one of the largest milk producers in the world, with the average US cow producing 4 times more milk than the average global cow. This greater per cow productivity results in the US having the smallest greenhouse gas emissions per unit of milk produced compared to other regions in the world. In closing, I'd like to mention a USDEC resource entitled A New Era for Protein, Why US Dairy Delivers in the Crowded Protein Marketplace. This free report can be found at thinkusadairy.org, and it details a comparison of protein ingredients from different sources based on their functionality and sensory attributes. USDEC and the US dairy industry are your innovation partners, and our offices around the world are ready to assist you in a variety of ways, such as providing formulation and application ideas, technical support, and identifying dairy ingredient suppliers to meet your specific needs. Thank you very much for participating in our webinar today. We hope you found it useful.
Perfecto, regresamos.
Perfect. We are back with our Q&A session. First of all, thank you very much, Terry, Matt, Mary, for your interesting presentations. And of course, thanks to all our attendees. We have a very strong audience today, and we also have several questions for the session. So we are gonna try to answer all the questions, but if we are not able to do it, we are going to reply back to them via email. So please continue sending your questions, and let's see. it is a little bit difficult to choose which question ask first, but we have a very interesting one that we receive at the beginning. It comes from Frank. Frank is asking, which protein is the one that provides the greatest nutritional characteristics, the egg or milk protein, and which one is the healthiest? Who can answer that question? Maybe Matt?
Por favor.
Sure. Thanks, Carolina, and thank you, Frank, for your question and interacting with us today. So I will start by saying, both dairy and egg proteins are complete and high quality proteins. So whether it's in the form of an ingredient or whether it's in the form of the whole food, egg or milk, they both bring high quality protein to the diet, as well as, potentially other nutrients and unique nutrients, vitamins and minerals and such, that are provided if you consume them with the whole food. What I will say, from an ingredient perspective, if you're comparing egg protein ingredient to a whey protein ingredient or milk protein concentrate, let's say, the dairy proteins have, as some of the slides I referred to in my presentation, they may not have had the egg data specifically because I had been primarily focused on comparing dairy to some of the plant-based alternatives. But dairy proteins have, the highest concentration of leucine and total essential amino acids in comparison to essentially all other proteins. So again, while both of these examples that you raised are high quality, I think, again, hopefully it was clear in my presentation that it's really the efficiency with which dairy proteins, are able to deliver those essential amino acids and leucine that are required to optimize muscle health and other metabolic processes in the body that require these essential amino acids. That's really one of the true values that dairy proteins provide, as well as, from all the functional and taste attributes that Mary highlighted in her section of the presentation.
Perfecto, Matt. Solo algunos
Perfect, Matt. Only a few comments, not for the content, but to the attendees. You are asking about translation. We have simultaneous interpretation available due to Zoom functionality. So please go to the bottom of your screen, on your Zoom screen, and choose the language. So choose interpretation. Another comment is, yes, we are going to send you the recording of the webinar and also the slides that are translated. So please stay with us because we have a very interactive session with lots of questions. Thank you very much, Matt. I have another question, and I think it's also for Matt, and it's from an anonymous attendee. So thanks for sending the question, but what is the excess protein level value above 0.gram kilogram of body weight? The body does not absorb or use the protein and is eliminated.
Yes, thank you for your question. This question or concept is quite common. I have heard it raised by a number of people in various audiences that I've interacted with. And I'll start by saying that, there is no level at which the body will no longer absorb the protein. So you could continue to eat more and more protein. Your body will be able to digest and absorb the protein. The point there to make is that, more so on, what is a level at which your body will most efficiently utilize that protein and those digested amino acids for the role in which they are intended in the body. So whether that's supporting muscle protein synthesis or that's supporting the synthesis of other body proteins, whether they're immune proteins, the making of enzymes and other roles in which these amino acids and then formed proteins are needed in the body. And from that perspective, we do have some insights, some of which I tried to highlight in my presentation from the data we know in muscle health, which is probably our best scientific indicator to provide some guidelines as to how much protein our body can efficiently utilize. And I'll say this at each individual mealtime is what's known. So for younger adults, somewhere between 20 to 30 grams of high quality protein is utilized to support, say, muscle protein synthesis. And at protein exceeding that amount, again, when we're talking about higher quality proteins, that protein is no longer going to be utilized by that muscle. You may recall I mentioned that muscle full effect, where I gave the analogy of pouring water into the cup. There will be a point at which that water starts to flow out of that cup. And with high quality proteins such as dairy, that cup will be full somewhere between 20 and 30 grams. And the remaining protein will be oxidized by the body. It will be either used for energy, some of the waste from that oxidation of the protein will be excreted as urea. It will then be either converted to glucose, stored as glycogen, and or converted to fat to store. Again, if you're in an excess calorie state. Now, older adults, they require a bit more. So we would say to efficiently utilize that protein from a muscle standpoint, upwards of 30 to 40 grams of protein. Again, depending on the condition, might be optimal. From a total diet standpoint, I have not seen research that has shown any value of greater than about 2 grams of protein per kilo body weight. You might note either in the sports and exercise recommendations or the recommendations geared toward older adults that I mentioned, 2 grams of protein per kilo body weight per day was close to that amount where it's not clearly established that additional benefits will be seen at higher protein intakes. Yeah, thank you.
Perfecto, muchas gracias, Matt.
Thank you very much, Matt. Now, we have a couple of questions for Mary. And the first one, Mary, is, if I want to use whey protein, what type of application will be best?
Well, that's a really great question. And whey protein has really been on the rise.
Solo un momento. Mary, no puedo verte. Okay. Sí, siga. Perdóname.
Sorry, I wasn't able to see you, Mary, but yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, great. That's a great question. Whey protein launches globally have been on the rise. There was over 17,000 last year. And traditionally, you probably know whey protein has been more into sports nutrition, traditional dairy beverages, those types of categories. But what's interesting is, and this kind of relates back to what Matt was just saying, people are looking for getting protein at different day parts as well as for different need states. So for example, in the morning is a time that many people do not consume as much protein. And so we can create products specifically designed for that morning venue. And we can include things like probiotics to help with the immune function as well as the protein for your muscles. We can also put it into snacks. We've seen an increase in snacking during this pandemic, and it's not just traditional snacks. It's not just extruded snacks, but also it could be a, say, frozen ice cream snack. So a savory ice cream or a frozen dessert or a, so people are looking for different taste profiles to experiment. So where it used to be, you might say, oh, I want something sweet in the morning and something savory later in the day. People are mixing it up and they like little bites and pieces and snacks throughout the day. And even in the afternoon, sometimes we can get a little tired in the afternoon and we want that little pick me up. And so whey protein and protein snacks can be a great way to do that.
Qué interesante. Al seguimiento tengo otra pregunta.
I have another question. You mentioned that the proteins from different sources are processed in different ways, and the stages of processing affect solubility and the functionality. How can I verify or find this out?
So it is very important to understand this because your proteins can vary. So you need to really develop a relationship with your supplier. You need to ask questions about where's their source? Is it local or do they have to import raw materials in order to process their product? The product that you're receiving, ask about what are they doing for tests to ensure the quality of the protein, to ensure the consistency of particle size. And benchmarking is very important. So understanding what your key functional questions are for your product and to continue to benchmark, because many of these newer sources of protein are still newer in their development. And so as they scale up and expand production, there could be changes in their process. So it's important to keep an eye on that, especially if you're trying something that's not as well established as dairy proteins. The other thing is, as far as the US dairy ingredient market goes, the suppliers have become very customized and sophisticated in their offerings. So developing a relationship up front and having them share with them your process, like how you're mixing, how you're creating the product, what heat treatment is it going through, how are you packaging, what kind of shelf life are you looking for, what kind of mouthfeel are you looking for. All of these are key considerations, and if you have that conversation when you first start to do your formulation and you talk to your supplier, they may have products that already have some functionality built in. I'll give an example. We now have some, because proteins tend to buffer the pH when you're looking at high acid, low pH beverages. We now have some ingredient suppliers in the US that are offering pre-acidified proteins. So that means on your end, you'll have to add less acid and you'll get to your targeted pH sooner. The other thing to remember about those specific beverages too is just as you heat and process your finished product, the proteins will unfold, and so your final pH may change. And so having that pre-acidified product might be a benefit depending upon your application. Same thing goes for water binding, viscosity. There are different proteins that have been modified to address that, and it can save you a lot of headaches and a lot of extra work on the back end of your process.
Perfecto, Mary. Entonces, solo
Thank you
quería
very much, Mary. I just wanted to highlight the importance to work hand by hand with the suppliers of the ingredients. Also, I have the opportunity here to mention a question from Sergio. How can we acquire essential products that are high quality to create foods and beverages in the region or to develop new products? And us as USDEC, we can connect you with from the United States who can develop and provide the information and the most adequate ingredients for the product. So please stay in touch with our office so we can develop businesses as well. We have several questions about sustainability. So I can say that I have questions from Ivan, Oscar, and I have another question here. So the question is, the consumers every day are more aware of the sustainability issue and the environmental impact. It's one of their considerations when it comes to choosing the, can you talk about the environmental impact of dairy compared to other proteins? I think you all can comment on that, but who would like to start?
quizás, Matt. Sí, dale.
Matt, go ahead.
Sure, thank you. Certainly, as the question acknowledged, this is becoming, more and more of a hot topic amongst consumers, health professionals, and certainly in the scientific community as well. One thing I would like to say is that it's something that has been and will continue to be a priority for the U.S. dairy industry, and one that the industry collectively is committed to addressing and striving for continuous improvement in how dairy foods are produced and done in the most efficient way to be protective of the planet and at the best animal care with the animals that are used in production. So a couple key points I would like to note here when you're thinking about the environmental impacts of different foods and how they compare to each other is that one very important point that I've seen is that when you're looking at data, and I think one of the questions may have raised, greenhouse gas data, let's say, as one metric for environmental impact. And if you're looking at that data from, say, a dairy protein in comparison to an alternative protein, is that you need to make sure you are comparing, say, a phrase we use in the US is apples to apples, or you're comparing similar data points. And the concept there is that there are many stages of the life cycle that a food undergoes. It's growing the food, it's processing that food, it's packaging that food, it's then shipping that food and storing that food all the way from a farm to the consumer's table. And there is data that represents the environmental impact. And again, let's use greenhouse gas as one example. There is some data that takes the entire process and gives you a number. There is other data that only takes part of that process, let's say the on-farm segment of that process, and will report greenhouse gas data for that. So you must be clear when you are comparing the data from one food or ingredient to another, that that data was used with a similar and matched, segment of that life cycle, whether it be that complete life cycle or a segment of that life cycle. Because if that is not the case, the comparison is not valid and any conclusions made from that data are not valid. Additionally, I'd like to mention that US Dairy did complete a full life cycle assessment of the impact of milk production on the environment. And this was done in 2007, 2008. It's been, and remains to be, one of the first and then one of the most detailed and scientifically validated life cycle assessments that's been developed, because it's also been published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. And what was found was that US dairy contributes 2% to total US greenhouse gas, 5.1% of total water use, and 3.7% of total farmland use in the United States. And again, when you think of that, particularly in relation to the nutritional value that it provides, I feel that's very modest numbers, right? Very modest environmental impact from US dairy production, particularly in relation to the nutritional value it provides. And one last point I would like to make, and then I'm, would like to open it to Mary and/or Terry, who may have some comments, is that when you think about nutritional quality and how that interacts with the environmental impact, that's a last important point to mention, is that when we're looking at comparing different foods, what's done often is comparing, greenhouse gas emissions per the weight of the food. And we know that the weight does not give any indication as to the nutritional value that that food provides. And really, we should be thinking about the environmental impact or the environmental cost of that food in relation to the nutritional value that it provides, because a food that provides more nutritional value should essentially be allowed to have, a little bit more of an environmental impact, because it's that cost benefit, right? If I'm paying a certain cost, what's the benefit I'm getting from that cost? And one way that's starting to be looked at when comparing different proteins, be it dairy and plant-based proteins, is looking at the greenhouse gas emission or land use or water use in relation to the quality of the protein that it provides. And what we've seen in that literature is that these differences or gaps with dairy proteins or even other animal proteins contributing more to greenhouse gas than some plant proteins, that difference is significantly reduced or can even be flipped, where dairy is more efficient in comparison to some plant proteins when you compare them for the quality of the protein they provide relative to the greenhouse gas that they produce.
And I can add to that.
Claro.
So if you remember on my chart when I was talking about the cow being so unique, she is the original upcycler. That 80% of food that's not digestible or that's insoluble, that comes from plants. It comes from plant byproducts. So right now, that any plant protein is not sustainable without an animal to consume those side streams. So it's way more complicated, as Matt alluded to. And so that dairy cow and what she does, not just only creating a highly nutritious, high quality protein, but she's doing that in the context of taking care of those other components that are in the world so that, obviously we don't have piles upon piles of plant materials. Also, as I said before, there's a water component, and this is a newer area. And I think over time, you'll see it continue to be very important. But because the cow brings the water in through the milk, and then that water gets recycled, as I showed in that one diagram, there isn't a lot of extra water added into the system. The water is coming through the system, where the plant proteins, because they start from a dry material that then has to be ground and processed and extracted and to purify the protein, each of those steps has a co-product or something that comes off. And those co-products are still relatively new to the industry and still have to find homes or value-added homes for those co-products, where the dairy industry has been utilizing those streams to create co-products. So like the permeate that we talked about earlier, that is now a value-added ingredient that can be used specifically in your formulation to enhance the flavor, especially if you're looking at a savory application. So the dairy industry has done a great job of utilizing those streams and continuing to look to those streams for more value for you, the food formulators.
Claro, Terry.
I'd like to just,
Sí.
yeah, thanks. I'd like to just add a little bit, to further on what Mary was saying. The humans and the cows, we have quite a synergistic relationship, right? That the cows eat the materials that the humans can't and produce this highly nutritious product that's, for humans. So, but this idea that, that is growing in the world that, we shouldn't have animal agriculture. It's very, it's quite controversial, but there've been a number of studies showing what would happen if we did not have cows, if we didn't have animal agriculture. And it really shows that the data so far anyway shows that there really would not be an improvement from a greenhouse gas standpoint in the world. And also there would be, without animal agriculture, there would be challenges producing enough nutritious food to feed everyone in the world, because to Matt's point, the nutrition in dairy and in animal products is so concentrated that you can feed a lot more people with less food. And as the population of the world is growing rapidly, it's really animal-based products, including dairy, that are going to be required to feed everyone. So this idea that animals are the problem and that animal agriculture is the problem is just completely turned upside down. It's really that, and we believe that animal agriculture is really part of the solution. And we know that, like I said, it's controversial. And so we're doing all of our homework to show the data behind this so that we can help people understand, that everything in the world has an environmental impact. As soon as we're born as babies, we have an impact. All of us sitting here watching this webinar, we have an impact, but animal agriculture can help minimize that impact. And that's really what we're continuing to focus on developing that story and helping people to understand, really what's behind that.
Gracias a todos, bastante interesante.
Thank you very much to all. The conversation has been really interesting. Terry, I have a question to you. And the three of you have already mentioned the sustainability and the production of the ingredients in the United States. I wanted you to mention a little bit about the origin, because the ingredients from milk from the United States are considered high quality, or is there a particular advantage or difference? Can you mention a little bit about that in regards to the United States products?
Right. Thanks for that question. So we've talked quite a bit about dairy proteins in comparison to non-dairy proteins like plants, for example, but that's only part of the story. It's not just about choosing dairy, but we want people to understand what are the advantages of choosing US dairy, and in this case of this webinar, US dairy proteins. So as Matt and Mary have both alluded to, it's, first it's about how the milk is produced, right? But and the whole sustainability story there. But when the milk is coming out of the cow, no matter what country it's being produced in, it's pretty similar, right? Milk produced in the United States versus New Zealand versus Europe versus South America, it's pretty similar. And so really it's about how that milk is processed and how it's treated and how it's fractionated into different components. That's really where the difference starts to come in. And so from a processing standpoint, the US dairy industry, as we've alluded to, produces year-round, safe, sustainable supply. And our processors have almost unlimited production to make a wide variety of products. We're a big country with a lot of dairy production, but a lot more can be produced. There's a wide variety of different types of production facilities. So for customers, for food and beverage processors like yourselves, sourcing from the US, you have a very broad choice of different types of products and different solutions that we can offer you to meet your needs and help accelerate your growth, help your businesses prosper as well. So as Carolina mentioned, it's really about connecting with US processors, with Carolina and her team, and they will put you in touch with US suppliers to really help meet your very specific needs. And we feel that that's something that helps make us unique in the world of processors, that we can give you the whole solution to any of your needs. We can provide a solution.
Perfecto, Terry. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Terry. We have over 50 questions and we are reaching the end of the webinar, but we are going to answer a couple of questions. And talking about a variety of suppliers and ingredients, I want to ask Alejandra's question. Alejandra is asking if it's possible to have formulation without lactose using whey protein and milk protein with additional processes. Talking about portfolio, who could provide an answer? Maybe Terry, Mary?
I can start. So yes, there are opportunities to utilize whey protein and milk proteins that have low lactose levels. So in the instance of whey protein isolate, it virtually has no lactose. It's been filtered out. We also have micellar casein, which is on the milk side of the equation, and it's 90 to 95% protein itself. So it also has those lower lactose and lower whey levels that give it some unique attributes, especially when you put it into high heat UHT or retort conditions. And so there are multiple options, and we also have hydrolyzed lactose products as well. So they're depending upon your finished product and your target, you may use one or the other, but there are many suppliers that can deliver you options to try.
Gracias, Mary.
Thank you very
Okay.
much, Mary.
Hemos
Another
visto
question. We have seen that these questions are very similar, and including one from Cesar. I've heard that high level protein diets could have a negative impact on health, in particular of the kidneys health and bone health. Can you talk a little bit about that, please, Matt?
Sure. And, that's something, a question or perception I frequently hear as well. Again, when I'm interacting with consumers or even many health professionals. And I think that concept continues to be repeated by many, and it's unfortunate because I will say, my opinion, as well as I would say the opinion of many of the expert scientists in the area, is that there is really no evidence that in healthy adults, so I want to clarify, in healthy adults with no pre-existing medical conditions, protein within the range of the acceptable macronutrient distribution range that's been established by the National Academy of Science in the US. I referred to that in my presentation. That's about 10 to 35% total calories. And or if we look at, levels at 2 to upwards of 3 times the RDA for protein. So, the RDA is zero point 0.8 grams per kilo. You could be anywhere up to 2 grams per kilo, maybe, 2.5 grams per kilo. And again, I am not aware of any data that would support clearly that that level of protein intake has a negative impact on either bone health or kidney health. Um, Actually, there's data to show that, appropriate and adequate high quality protein intake is actually essential for bone health, in addition to the bone building minerals such as calcium and vitamin D and phosphorus, for example. The appropriate amount of high quality protein in the diet is also critical for bone health. So, again, thank you for your question, because I think it's important to continue to try and illustrate that the latest science does not indicate protein at the levels I mentioned being of any concern. And again, if there is an adult or child with pre-existing medical condition, then yes, um, particular clinical practice guidelines say as patients that have kidney problem, kidney disease, then they need to follow the clinical practice guidelines where protein could be a problem. Thank you.
Okay, gracias, Matt.
Thank you, Matt. We have finished the event, and I just wanted to mention that we have lots of questions that are very specific about formulations, the use of proteins in very specific products. So, of course, we are going to answer all of them after the event. So, please do not worry because we'll continue in touch. I just wanted to conclude the Q&A session. Thank all of you for your assistance. Thank the attendees, and also please write to our experts from today, right? To their emails are available for you to reach out to them. And we also have the email from our office in South America. So please, in case you have any doubts, write us. Another recommendation for you here today is to go to US Dairy website, which is thinkusdairy.org, and there you will be able to find a lot of technical information in regard to the application of milk ingredients and details about the products from milk from the United States, and also a lot of inspiration that was presented in this webinar. Also, we are going to send you a participation certificate, the recording of the webinar, and the slides translated. So please check your emails in the upcoming days because our team will be in touch with you, Carolina, Clarice, and Paola, and everyone that works in River Global in South America. Our lovely attendees, we have some final remarks. I just wanted to let you mm, give last words. Terry?
So I just want to agreeing with Carolina, thank everyone for your attendance and for your attention, and really pleased that there was so much interest and so many questions. And keep those questions coming. It's not just about this webinar today, but it's about building relationships so that we can really help you. So make sure that you reach out to any of us. And again, thanks so much for participating today.
Antes de seguir con los comentarios
Before we continue with the comments from Matt and Mary, I just wanted to ask you to answer a final survey, which is the evaluation of our webinar.
¿Cómo califican este webinar?
How do you evaluate this webinar?
Van a ayudarnos bastante.
You are going to help us very much to help us plan our next activities. And of course, how can we help you to develop new products using United States milk?
Bastante interacción.
There is a lot of interaction. A few more seconds.
Solo más un momento. Perfecto.
Perfect.
Ya está.
Okay.
Terminando la encuesta, solo voy a compartir con ustedes los resultados y agradecerles.
We are finishing the survey. I'm going to share the results with you. And once again, thanking you for the assistance and being here with us and for the positive evaluation from today. Perfect. Okay, let's continue with the closing remarks. Matt?
Yes, thank you, Carolina. Thank you to all attendees. Again, similar to the comments from Terry, we're just really excited, that you were able to join us today. And we did our best to try to convey a lot of the latest science and information that we felt would be most helpful to you. But certainly there is so much more information to provide and share. And again, as Terry mentioned, please, consider us a resource as you move forward in whatever efforts you may be considering the use of dairy proteins, whether it be on the nutrition and health side, the product development side, and application side. Our staff across all of us who have been involved today and the greater staff that we have behind the scenes, we could continue and want to work with you to provide the solutions to grow your business. So thank you, and look forward to communicating with you in the future.
Gracias, Matt. Mary?
Thank
And
you,
I
Matt.
just-
Mary?
And I just want to say from a personal standpoint, I am just thrilled to see all of your questions around dairy protein. When I started my career, dairy protein was just not really spoke of or thought of. And there's been so many technological advances and exciting new products to try. And I'm so glad that I was able to share a little bit today. And please, if you have specific needs, please contact your office staff, contact USDEC. There's so many new opportunities every day when it comes to protein, and it will solve so many problems for you before you encounter them. So please reach out and develop those relationships. So thanks so much.
Gracias a todos. Perfecto, entonces un gusto estar
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure for us to be here, for being here today, and I will see you next time in our next event. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye.